everyone, it's Kevin, and in this video, I'm gonna walk through this 2D 3D recreation of my dream office in Blender 3D with grease pencil. It's been a while since I uploaded. I had to take some time these past couple of weeks and was pretty sick, but I'm all better now and ready to talk about this new scene. So this project was kind of ambitious for me. Initially, I just wanted to update my branding, specifically my avatar and logo. I hadn't done it in a couple of years and it was definitely time for a refresh. But the more I thought about it, the scope grew, and I thought it'd be interesting to create an entire scene to be some sort of hero visual. So the primary things I wanted to include in this scene were a new avatar, a logo, and some fun imagery that represented me and things I was interested in. Branding has always been my favorite part of any creative project. I love being able to give an identity to something that embodies what it is. However, when doing anything for myself, it usually takes a little bit longer because I can overthink certain design decisions and I subconsciously feel like there are other things I should be working on. But I knew this was sorely needed, so I prioritized it. To me, this is super important and I see it kind of like cleaning. Although it can seem like just aesthetics, it allows me a moment to think about myself and who I am as a creative, what I want to accomplish, and the message that I want to put out there. So I've had my current avatar and logo for about 5 to 6 years now. This is back when I was live streaming design on Twitch, running my own clothing and handmade accessories business, and actively freelancing. It's worked for me, and I even turned my avatar into a talking head for certain videos as an experiment. But I've been thinking about who I am currently and what my goals are. So first and foremost, I'm an artist and designer. Before, I used to only consider myself a designer, and this is primarily because when I was younger, I was very rule-driven in my creation process. But now I consider myself both. I love learning and exploring new technology and sharing that knowledge, and my goal is to tell stories and craft experiences through what I create. So it was really important that the visuals, including the scene, embodied the spirit of these sentiments. And that meant having an environment bring these ideas together to supplement that direction. So it's not necessarily my dream office, but a piece for me in 2023. I used a lot of new techniques here and experimented with features I don't normally work with, so it was a nice and fun challenge. To walk through this, I'll start with my logo, then the avatar, and then go into the scene breakdown. The logo was the first thing I created. If you follow me on Instagram, I shared some progress over the past couple of months that I did in Procreate. And like the previous one, I opted to hand letter it, going with a brush pen look instead of monoline. I love calligraphy and it's a skill I really enjoy practicing, although I don't do it as often as I used to. Typography has usually been a prominent subject in my work, so I decided early on to keep that consistent. However, I use my full name instead of my online handle. My handle comes from the first 3 letters of my first, middle, and last name, so Kevin Andrew Ramirez, but I think it caused confusion as I would commonly get called Kevin with an AN, which makes sense. It was also kind of hard to pronounce, so to avoid that, I just opted to use my actual name. Moving on to my avatar, my current rubber hose one comes from these 2 illustrations specifically. I made these when I was really active live streaming, working in Photoshop and Illustrator, and my style was a lot more street inspired. So for this new avatar, I thought it'd be fitting to use Blender, reflecting the art that I do now since it's been my main creative program for the past 3 years. However, I wasn't sure if I was going to create this with just grease pencil or model it in 3D. Weighing the options, modeling it in 3D would make it more compatible with other programs, and drawing it with grease pencil would make it more intuitive. Ultimately, I decided on a hybrid for this piece, combining both meshes and grease pencil elements, since that's what I was most familiar with. Now, within those 3 years since learning Blender, I hadn't really modeled anything intensively, and more specifically, a human. I have modeled a head, and this was for a piece I did 2 years ago. Modeling a full body, rigging it, and then integrating grease pencil elements was going to be a challenge, but also exciting since it was something I always wanted to do. I started with concepting the avatar redesign in Procreate. I kept a lot of the features the same, notably the front hair floof, but wanted it a little less rubber hose. So I created a rough front and side view of the body to help with modeling and then took it into Blender. After setting up my references, I began with modeling the head. I started with a mesh sphere and slowly started to form the features, using the various sculpt tools. At this point, I remember being unsure if I was going to model the actual features like the eyes and mouth. I did actually model those in the process, but decided to create them with grease pencil for now. I closed up the gaps and left the model flexible in case I wanted to recreate those later on. I then created the ears, then the hair, keeping its shape really simple but accurate to the reference. I ran ran into a bit of trouble figuring out how to do this anatomically, but it worked out. And I did add some temporary shading to see what I was working with and refine that later on. Moving on to the body, this is where I referenced a great tutorial by Sociomix. It was super helpful in understanding how to model male anatomy, and I'll leave a link below. Going off my very rough sketch, I was able to model a physique close to what I was going for. This process was a great learning experience because I understood how to form geometry correctly. After the body, I moved on to the arms, then the hands and fingers. I was fully intending to animate the hands and fingers, so I spent some time at this part. Once I was done with the base mesh, I moved on to sculpting to accentuate some of the muscles. After the body, I moved on to the clothing. I really wanted an emphasis here since the idea was that this avatar could have multiple outfits. Thought this would be fun to create as opposed to what I had previously. However, clothing was another challenge I hadn't tried before, so I thought about what would work well for this character. I opted not to go too complex since I was still figuring out this workflow, but I thought some standard articles of clothing refined with grease pencil would be fine. So I initially started with a sweater as a callback to the previous avatar, pants, and a hooded vest. The process involved creating geometry over the character in the shape of clothing. Then I added some modifiers to give the meshes more geometry and used cloth physics to adhere them to the model. I then used more modifiers to smooth it out. I also added some pockets for detail, and the clothing base was finished. There was a lot more experimentation and back and forth to see what worked best, but this was a rough overview of how that process went. After this, I didn't like how the sweater looked, so I changed it to a t-shirt. I also added shoes to the model, but this was later on in the process. After modeling, I wanted to rig the model so I could pose it. I wasn't sure how I was going to do this because, again, I was still fairly new to this process. Initially, I thought to use Mixamo, which is a feature from Adobe that allows you to animate 3D characters. Because I already had Adobe, this made sense, but I decided to use Rigify since that seemed to be a standard within Blender. If you don't know what Rigify is, it's a free add-on in Blender that allows you to automate the creation of character rigs. For this, I referenced another helpful tutorial from Pixel 3D, and I'll put another link to their channel below. Once installed, I brought in a human meta rig. I removed the facial bones since I was going to rely on grease pencil and lined up everything from the neck down the body and then to the limbs and fingers. Once I had everything in place, I generated the rig. I parented all my meshes with automatic weights to the rig. For the most part, it worked well, but I had to weight paint certain vertices in order to make sure it moved with the correct deformation bone. At this point, the modeling for the avatar was for the most part done. The major things I had left to do was shade it and add the grease pencil details. But I thought it would be helpful to do that in context, so I moved on to building out the scene. For the scene, I knew I wanted to create a workspace. Looking at my actual office, I used it as a starting point with the floating shelves and IKEA furniture. It was also important that I included the smaller items and imagery I had displayed. With this idea set, I worked directly in Blender. I posed my model sitting on something, again with temp shading, and started to block out major elements like a computer, desk, walls, and the frames. I also added shoes at this point since I wasn't sure what the exact camera angle was going to be. I modeled more things like an office chair, mug, mouse, planters, and a lamp. Generally, when I see office illustrations like this, it's usually with the subject's back facing the camera with a focus on the monitor or from the side. Since I wanted to bring emphasis to the avatar and the elements around the room, I decided to have him facing the camera. Now, with the major pieces in place, I thought of what I wanted to fill this space with. The first thought was plants. I love plants and have many of them, from succulents to tropical ones. Plants make my space feel alive, and it was important that the space felt verdant. The second were frames. I have a lot of framed items that have special meaning, so I wanted to feature them prominently. And the last thing was to have items that represented me and things I liked. In addition to art, I have a lot of hobbies from baking, working out, creative coding, and playing video games. I also like dancing, playing the piano, snowboarding, and tricking. I wasn't sure how I was going to represent all of these, but I added what made sense. I'm also a fan of certain properties and thought it'd be fun to include some collectibles I own and Easter eggs from them. Overall, I wanted the scene to feel like a toy town with lots of kinetic energy. With the idea figured out, I rendered the 3D scene in its current state and started a concept over it. I usually prefer this workflow, building off something established, so I can make sure the design is cohesive. For some inspiration, I usually go to Pinterest, or more recently, I've generated some images with AI just to get some ideas. This is where I started to think about what was going to be modeled or drawn with grease pencil. Now, if you don't know what grease pencil is, it's an object within Blender that allows you to draw 2D and 3D space. And combining it with 3D meshes has been a staple in my workflow. The advantage of having a tool like this is that you can achieve a lot more depth as opposed to a flat 2D illustration. You can also have all the capabilities of Blender, including animation. And lastly, it's completely free. I really gravitated towards this workflow because while I love the look of 2D, I want my pieces to feel immersive as if you're there. After the concept, I went back to Blender. Now, the final scene has a lot going on, so I'm just gonna walk through what my workflow was and then talk about the specific elements I added after. I started with modeling the secondary items like the headphones, electronic cords, and plant vessels. Then figurines, hats, and floor planters. After that, a digital piano, keyboard, and storage bins to fill up the space. And some of these items were taken from projects I worked on previously to save time. After modeling, I moved on to shading. I spent some time on this part because I wanted to create a toon shader compatible with Blender Eevee that reacted to different colored light sources. If you've seen my simple toon shaders video, you'll know you can set one up pretty easily. However, I wanted one that not only reacted to the intensity of light sources in the scene, but also the color. I've been doing some experiments prior to this, and the most recent one was the anime-inspired city I did a few months ago. To help, I referenced a really helpful channel, Lightning Boy Studio, for some ideas, and I'll put a link to them below. I did some more experimenting and was able to achieve a more refined shader here that worked for the style I was going for. I wanted a cel-shaded look with the ability to augment it with lights for some slight color variation. This was to give a sort of richness to the piece. Now, you can easily achieve this augmentation with grease pencil, so having both the shader and grease pencil elements respond to the color of a light source helped in making the design feel cohesive. After shading, I added outlines around all the meshes. There are a few methods for achieving outlines. I was debating whether or not to use the line art modifier here, which is a grease pencil feature that automatically outlines edges of a mesh. However, I decided to go with another method, which is using the solidify modifier and a material with backface culling. Although it's a bit more labor intensive and it doesn't work for every edge, I feel like I have more control over it, which is what I needed for this scene. I made the outline color a medium to dark brown and carried that over into my grease pencil materials as well. After shading and adding the outlines, I moved on to grease pencil. This is where I drew the illustrative details on the meshes and outlined the edges that lacked it. This included the pieces on the desk and its items, furniture, books, frames, etc. To do this, I switched my grease pencil stroke placement to surface and was able to easily draw on the meshes, again using the same brown color as the mesh outline. The prominent grease pencil elements are the plants. I wanted a variety of them, so I picked specific ones to add. When drawing these, I made sure to segment them in layers in the Y, so although they look flat, their appearance has dimension at different angles. Here, I've drawn strokes in the front, the middle, and the back. This hierarchy also helped when animating those layers, which I'll touch on in the next few sections. After the plants, I moved on to filling up the scene with more elements. Most of them were drawn in the same way in the front orientation, utilizing the 3D cursor for placement or on a mesh surface. And because all the meshes were toon shaded, it was really easy to blend them together with grease pencil. The other more prominent grease pencil elements were the ones on the model. I again wanted it to feel illustrated with an emphasis on the clothing, so I used grease pencil for the face and drew details onto the clothing. This included the accent lines, the zipper, and drawstrings on the hooded vest. Now that the grease pencil elements on the model were in place, I moved on to animating it. Since I had the model rigged, I was able to animate with the various controls. I have him leaning forward, thinking, waving, typing, etc. to complete a looping sequence. I really enjoyed this process as I could play around with different movements like with the fingers. I just needed to make sure the face was viewed at an optimal angle where it didn't break visually. I also wanted the model to interact with the environment, so I used object constraints to have the swivel chair turn as his hips rotated and the mouse to follow his hand movement as he gripped it. Now, the tricky part was to make sure that the grease pencil strokes stayed in place on the surface of the model while it was animating. To do that, I made sure to create different layers according to the nearest deformation bone and parented the strokes accordingly in the layers panel. It worked for the most part, but I had to do some tweaking for certain elements like the zipper. Parenting layers to certain bones allowed me to create some loose elements like the hair strands and play around with animating the strokes like the necklace to simulate movement. For the face, I just animated it traditionally with grease pencil animation tools and matched the model's movement as much as possible. Again, grease pencil has a solid array of animation tools, including interpolation, onion skinning, and stroke adjustment options. To animate the other grease pencil elements, I just created a looping sequence either drawing by hand or using the adjustment tools. Then I added a time offset modifier in order to get the sequence to repeat. Now, one aspect you might notice here is frame rate. This scene is 30 frames per second, but consists of very different ones. And for the grease pencil objects specifically, I wanted them at a lower frame rate. For the ones like the Ghibli Totoro figures on the desk here, the objects themselves are animated using armatures, so their animation is inherently 30 frames per second. However, to match the other grease pencil elements, I added an F-curve modifier called stepped interpolation to lower it. Now, if you follow me on social media, you might have seen these reels showing moving shadows on the plants. These were part of a series of tests I was doing with rigs. I wanted the plants to feel alive, and because I had divided the plants into sections in the Y, I thought to animate those sections individually. I didn't do this for every plant because it was tedious, but did it for the more notable ones. For example, if we look at this peace lily, you can clearly see the back, middle, and front sections here. Each section has their own vertex group and lattice armature rig. I added multiple bones to affect different parts of the lattice, and by moving those bones, I was able to move the lattice and grease pencil points within it. I did use F-curve modifiers like noise for location and rotation in order to help automate the animation instead of doing it manually. And I used this technique on the other bones set to different scale, strength, and phase values for variation. In addition to this, I also animated certain grease pencil strokes with the interpolation tools for some interesting results. To create the shadows for the leaves, I duplicated the fill layer for those specific leaves, sent it underneath the original, set the fills to black, blending mode to multiply, and opacity to 0.5. Then I shifted the strokes diagonally a bit and added the other fill layers below as masks. This was to have them show up only on top of the other fills. And because this was a duplicate of the fill layer, it was automatically part of the vertex group it was assigned to, retaining the same animation. Now, in one of those reels, I'm drawing the shadows in real time, and this was set up the same way, except I set my 3D cursor to the fill I wanted my shadow under and my drawing plane to front. Then on the new layer, I selected the associated vertex group and toggled the option Add Weight Data for new strokes. Then as I drew, the strokes adhered to the same animation. At some point soon, I'll add this Peace Lily project file with its rig on my Gumroad page for free and for anyone that wants to check it out. And that was the rough workflow for this scene, so now I'm going to talk about these specific elements that I added. On my desk, I have my actual iPad and orange notebook. There's a digital piano behind me because I like to play, and a Nintendo Switch model because I like to play video games. The Nintendo Switch model is also one of the first things I created in Blender. Below that, I have some snapbacks. The top one has this H logo, which stands for Hunter, which is a company I created a few years ago. The hat underneath is supposed to say Baking Bro, which is my specific Instagram handle where I post my bake creations if you want to check it out. Moving on to the frame portraits, the left side are all scenes I created previously. I have the Haunted Mansion piece, anime-inspired city, Explorer's Treehouse, and the Wild type piece featured. Towards the top is art from an original idea I hope to flesh out more this year, and going to the right to the dog is another original creation called Little Maxwell. This character is based off my actual dog, and I've already created a few animations for it. You can find some of them on Instagram at Little Maxwell the dog. I plan to cultivate this idea a lot more this year as well. Now, I also wanted to include properties in this scene that influenced or inspired me with their art and storytelling. So next to Little Maxwell is a framed image from the Studio Ghibli film called The Wind Rises. I love Ghibli films because not only are they beautifully drawn, but they're also extremely transportive with the way they capture each scene. This framed image is based off one of the first 2D 3D scenes I tried recreating in Blender with grease pencil. Above that is Roronoa Zoro with his three-sword style, who is a character from the series One Piece. One Piece is kind of a recent thing for me. I remember a few years ago we had a coworker join our team that worked as a producer on animes like Dragon Ball Z and One Piece. I knew what Dragon Ball Z was because I had grown up watching it as a kid, but he had gifted me a One Piece sticker set and I had no idea what One Piece was. was. So during the pandemic, when it was streaming on Netflix, I decided to give it a watch and I've loved it ever since. It's very heartwarming, charming, imaginative, and the kind of show I wished I watched when I was a kid. I have another reference to One Piece on the left side, Chopper, who is another character. A prominent series featured here is Final Fantasy. If you don't know what Final Fantasy is, it's a video game series released by Square Enix in the 80s with its first installment and its 16th installment releasing in about 2 weeks. It's an anthology series, so they're not connected, but these games were super impressionable on me. They have the quintessential hero's journey, high fantasy narrative, and immersive world building. The first one I played personally was 7 and have since played most of them in some capacity except maybe 11, which is its first MMO. This is probably because I was playing World of Warcraft at the time or other Blizzard games. But as of the past few years, I have been playing Final Fantasy XIV, which is its newer MMO. And I think now in 2023, it's the most played one globally. Initially, I was extremely skeptical to jump into this game because I knew it was an MMO and didn't want to play one, but I have since fallen in love with it and it's become one of my favorite games. It feels like a single player experience with a focused narrative that also happens to have people inside of it, which is the perfect balance for me. It really resonated with me because of its well-told story, fun cast of characters, various worlds, and top-tier soundtrack. In this scene, I have a couple of references to it, specifically its creatures like this Namazu, which is this standing catfish, a cactuar, Moogle, and the various figures on my desk combined with the Ghibli Totoro ones. Another series I love is Nier, which is also published by Square Enix. It was a game I was also unsure about, but then grew on me later. It's sitting on the piano with notes because it's my favorite video game soundtrack of all time. Those used to be either Chrono Trigger or Kingdom Hearts, and they still are, but now it's more so Nier. The music has various influences, but it's primarily inspired by classical music, which is what I was trained on when I was younger and why I gravitated towards it. It's amazing from a composition standpoint, but more importantly, effective as a storytelling tool. Each track varies from one another melodically, and they all somehow perfectly capture the tone and context they're featured in. I often listened to this soundtrack repeatedly when I was at work or at the gym. I even mentioned this in a fan event video that Square Enix made for the Nier team. So I got this piano book as a gift and have been trying to learn these songs from the series since. I learned some like this one, but would like to be more diligent in my practice. Other items are this slime on the bookshelf, which is from the Dragon Quest series, Gudetama, because some days we all feel like Gudetama. On the Nintendo Switch, I have a scene from Octopath Traveler 2, which is a recent game. I actually just beat this one and loved the story, music, and callbacks to earlier RPGs. I also have references to Super Mario. I really love the Super Mario and Sanrio aesthetic because it's clean and very nostalgic for me. So I have the stars at the top, and at the bottom right, the very first grease pencil project I uploaded on this channel. This was an 8-bit Mario I wanted to experiment with by creating in 3D. Obviously, it would have been easier just to model out the different pixels with meshes, but it was a fun experiment at the time. I've also realized I've come a long way since then. The last property is on the left side, this owl. This is from a series called The Promised Neverland, which is a manga series. I watched the first season of the anime and that was excellent, but my sister and brother-in-law Tom, who are huge fans of the series, saw season 2 and weren't very happy about it. So they read the manga and apparently it changed everything. So they gifted me the entire manga series for Christmas, and you can see them behind me over there, and yes, it was even more excellent than I thought. I've never really read mangas before, and this is my first one, but I had such a great time with this. I really loved the character development and how the relationships were written. Now for the additional elements, I added some buildings in the background, including some clouds, and a stylized sky graphic I made in Photoshop. I placed my logo in the center outside the window and animated some elements inside of it. I included this alien I usually have in a lot of my scenes. He first appeared in the Little Maxwell animation, and I've tried to find ways to feature him since. The last few elements are the foreground details like the plants for some depth and diagonal strokes. I usually like having these lines in my design. I feel like they add an abstract component component, and I was able to play with hand-drawn animated effects. For lighting, I have a ton of lights in this scene, and not necessarily to provide lighting, but as I mentioned previously, for slight color variation. So I have both cooler and warmer point and spotlights all set to different strengths. For effects, I have a room effect on some of the grease pencil elements to highlight some edges, and all the grease pencil elements have blur on them set to the depth of field options. This allows for blurring depending on your camera settings. Lastly, I have bloom turned on and compositing glare nodes to intensify the light in the scene. And that's it for this scene. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown and that it was helpful in providing some ideas around 2D, 3D art in Blender. If you'd like to see progress on what I'm working on, you can follow me on Instagram at KevEndRam, where I'm most active. I suddenly got an influx of followers there, so if you're new here, welcome. And for those that bought my grease pencil course on CG Boost, thank you so much. There is an update planned. I know I've been lagging on this, but I'm actively working on it for release in a few months. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thanks again, and see you guys next time.